Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am chair of APA's New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 5th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Regulating Historic Signs. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box on your GoToWebinar toolbar, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in that questions box located in your webinar toolbar, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And throughout the presentation, the presenters may ask sort of a polling type question, and you can type your answers also into that chat box, and we'll collect those and report them out. And I also ask that if you have a particular question for a particular panelist, if you could please state who the panelist is that you want to answer your question. Okay, coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsors for 2019, and we also have a couple more coming to fill in that gap there down at the bottom. So thanks to all of our participating members for joining us and making these webcasts possible and also free to their members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by APA's County Planning Division. So thanks to them for sponsoring, and you can learn more about them by visiting planning.org/divisions. Next, coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these by visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Logging your CM credits, we are working on getting those credits logged. If you joined us last week, we had the same problem. We are working to get those credits for you. Yes, we will have them. They will be, this session will be available for 1.5 CM credits, potentially even by the end of the session, and I will let you know. And you can log those credits by heading over to planning.org, logging into your MyAPA account, and then you can either search for the event number or the title of today's webcast. Both of those will be available on our webcast webpage, particularly that event number. That's the easiest way to search to log your CM credits. And as soon as it's approved, I'll have that event number up on our webcast webpage, and I'll also have it on our Facebook page as well. Speaking of, like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, because you'll receive all the up-to-date information we have on upcoming sessions, any changes, cancellations, questions, letting you know when we have presentations up, when things are available for credit, things like that. So please be sure and like us. We're also recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel at the conclusion. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast, and the session will pop up along with almost 300 of our other webcasts that are available for your viewing pleasure. We'll also have a PDF of this presentation available at the conclusion of the session. Again, just head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, with that, that's the end of my housekeeping items. So I'm going to introduce James Carpentier, who is going to be kicking off today's session. And if you've joined us in the past and with the County Planning Division in the past, James is no stranger to you. He is currently the Director of State and Local Government Affairs with the International Sign Association. In this capacity, James works with and educates local officials and planners in the creation of reasonable and effective sign codes. Prior to that, James was the owner of Carpentier Consulting, LLC, where he specialized in sign variances, entitlements, and sign legislation. In addition, James was Director of Government Relations for one of the largest and most respected sign companies in the country. Regular speaker for sign topics at national, regional, and local workshops and webinars. James also has over 25 years experience as a certified planner in the public and private sectors. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Regional Analysis from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay and a Master's Studies in Public Administration and Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So with that, I am going to turn the controls over to James.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that introduction, and everyone, welcome to the webcast, Historic Sign Regulations, and thanks for taking the time to participate in this webcast, because I know everyone is extremely busy like I am. And first, I just wanted to thank the County Division for sponsoring this webcast. Well, we are fortunate to have an excellent panel today. And for some reason, I'm not able to forward.
Sometimes that first slide gets stuck. Try to right-click your mouse and click Next. And from here on out, you should be able to just press the Enter button.
Wow. Thank
Who knew?
you for that,
right?
Christine. Yes. Okay. So now, with that, we're just fortunate to have excellent speakers for this session today, and we have Al Barna. Unfortunately, could not be here. He had an emergency come up, but we have Randall and Holman, who will speak about San Francisco neon signs, and then we will have Lynette Schwartz, Historic Sign Conservation, talk about sign regulations in Burbank and Los Angeles, California, followed up by our last speaker, Stephanie Cisneros, Preservation Planner with San Francisco Planning Department, talking about the preservation program in San Francisco. The takeaways today are, hopefully you'll have an understanding of neon signs, and also the approaches that Burbank and Los Angeles and San Francisco have and how they regulate historic or vintage signs, and also the keys to developing this historic sign regulations and what makes a sign historic versus vintage. As a part of this presentation, we will try to have, and we are going to solicit right now, your favorite historic sign. If you have a historic sign that you love, could you please send that in the comment box as far as the city, state, and the name of your favorite sign, and maybe the cross streets too, if we have to pick it up that way, and tell us why it is your favorite sign. And then after our first speaker, we will pick one of the signs, and the panel will talk about your favorite sign and give you their thoughts on it. So I encourage you to let us know what your favorite historic sign is. And if you don't have one, that's okay. And the presentations will be available. I'm not sure if they're available right now, but they'll be available today, later for sure. And that'll include not only the presentations, but the neon best practices, which is done by the first speaker, and also Burbank regulations, and then some other resources also at this link that are related to this presentation and other resources that are just dealing with sign regulation also. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Randall Ann Holman, one of the co-founders of the San Francisco Historic Neon Network Advocacy Organization and co-authors of the book San Francisco Neon, Survivors and Lost Icons and Saving Neon, a Best Practices Guide. She raises awareness for the Bay Area's unique collection of historic neon signs via neon talks, tours, video screenings, and photo exhibits. They are also the producers of the annual Neon Speaks Symposium and Festival, a celebration of vintage neon and information sharing for the restoration best practices at sfneon.org. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randall Ann. And all right.
Okay, I'm ready to show my screen. And now hopefully everybody's seeing this, a beautiful postcard of San Francisco in the 1950s when Market Street, this is the view down Market Street to the Ferry Building, was just basically neon nirvana, in my opinion. We love to show this postcard when we start one of our talks because it really is dramatic in showing how much beautiful neon San Francisco had. We still have a lot. You don't think of San Francisco as a big neon town like you do New York or LA or even Vegas or Reno, but really there's some beautiful artistic signs that still exist. But Market Street was hit pretty hard, and that was because they dug a tunnel to put in the underground BART system. And when that happened, so many of these businesses really were just had to pack up and go home, and with them went their neon signs. And so I'll show you another view of Market Street. Oh, I have to do that little next slide thing, right? Let's see if I can do that. Nope. Okay. There we go. So of all the signs, there's one left, the Odd Fellows. Of all of these signs in this view, there's only one left. And that's what really inspired my husband Al and I to start documenting the neon signs that are vintage, if not historic, that still survive in San Francisco. And we decided to do a book since we're both photographers. So we put this out about 4 years ago. It was a really fun project to do. We did it as a Kickstarter book, and we thought, let's find out how many people out there are as crazy about neon as we are. And in fact, it got funded in 14 days from people all over the world. So we knew we were not alone. And like a lot of photographers that start documenting something, they eventually become advocates for the thing they documented. And that's what happened to us. So we started our nonprofit, San Francisco Neon, kind of like the book. And we do a lot of education about what is a neon sign and what makes it so special. So we'll just talk about that a little bit. And really, it's the light. It's that beautiful glow. And in fact, what happens inside a tube that's filled with neon is not so different from an aurora borealis. It's basically particles that get energized and give off a glow. I'm not a scientist, but I know a really great vintage technical illustration when I see one because I'm a graphic designer. And I found this beautiful drawing in the New York Neon book. So I asked Tom Rinaldi if we could borrow it. So it just kind of shows you like all the atoms that are bouncing around in a neon tube, and comes with this illustration too. And so just the real basic science is that you've got a negative cathode on one side, a positive on the other. They both go to transformer. And when you turn the electricity on, it glows. So that's basically the phenomenon of neon light. And the fascinating thing to me is that this technology has not changed in over 100 years. The way neon signs were built in the teens and the 20s and the 30s is still very much the way they're built now. The only thing that's really been improved is the transformers are better than they used to be. Although some sign guys will say those old transformers were also pretty awesome. Now, we call it neon, but in fact, you can use all of the noble gases, put them in a vacuum sealed tube, energize them, and they will give off their own particular light and own particular color. So neon is the familiar orange-red, but a lot of the signs that you see that light up are also filled with argon gas. Neon and argon are the most popular gases because they glow the brightest. And it's an amazing quality of light because you can see it from miles away, and yet when you're up close to it, it's very soft and it doesn't hurt your eyes. And can't think of another light source that really has that quality. Now, krypton, xenon, and helium can also be used, but the glow is not as bright and actually takes more electricity to get them illuminated. But these three gases are very popular in indoor neon sculpture, and the colors are much more subtle. But all of these can be used in a tube. However, we call them all neon signs because neon's just such a great word. It means new in Greek. Now, those were clear tubes that I showed you. Now, these tubes are coated with a phosphor coating, and that's how we get this wide variation of color. So you can, for instance, take a phosphor tube that's coated pink, put neon in it, and it gets an extra orange glow. But if you pump it with argon, then it kind of gets more of a blue pink glow. That's more of the candy pink. So you can really have this wide range of colors, and then depending on what gas you put in it, that also changes the quality of the color. And color is really what makes neon signs so special. Here's an example of a beautiful sign. Maybe this is one of my favorite signs in Sacramento, California. These are the jitterbuggers, the Tower Record sign. Now, this is one of the best tube benders in the Bay Area. Her name is Shawna Peterson. And this is a fun little picture because she's holding a tube that's not phosphor coated. The glass itself is actually gold. And it's so dramatic because this one particular glass, when you heat it up, and she's holding it over a flame on a ribbon burner, it turns bright red. So you can actually see that it's being heated. And we took some classes from Shawna, so we knew how hard it was to bend tubes. And now we realize more than being hard, it's a true art form. And Shawna's a great artist, but also a great sign restorer in the Bay Area. So let's talk a little bit about what holds the tubes. And it's the metal cabinet, and we're looking at one. This is the Blue Plate restaurant in San Francisco. And this cabinet is actually quite old, and they restored it by putting new glass tubes around it. Sometimes it's called a tin can. And tin cans can be basically just like palettes for a painter, just square, and it's really the painting on the tin can that gives the sign its message and its artistic quality. But then a step up from that, sometimes the tin can actually be configured or fabricated so that it's a great example of beautiful metalwork, and the message is really integrated into the overall shape of the sign. And then this is the Verde Club in San Francisco. And again, these wings, it's just beautiful metalwork. And we feel like this is where a sign really becomes a work of art. There's a couple different kinds of metal cabinets, so it's fun to look at the sign typology. Again, this is from the New York Neon book. When it sticks straight out from the wall, it's called a projecting sign. And let's see if I can do, there you go. And if it's on a pole with a guy wire, that's a swing sign. A tall vertical blade. And then if it's attached to a building, a fascia sign. And then if it's kind of sitting up on a raceway, it's a raceway sign. So that's just kind of a look at the anatomy of what goes into a neon sign. And we thought this would be a good moment to ask some questions. And so this is what fascinates us. Think of the neon sign in your community. And we kind of would love to, if you want to type this in, we'd love to hear what it looks like. And then think about it. Has it become a local landmark? Has it evolved from being advertising to something that has more meaning in your community? If there are, you have to tell me, Christine, if there are messages.
I will. Yeah, I'm waiting for them to come in.
Okay, great. Oh, good. So I'm seeing some now. The House of Doors.
Oh, these are the ones that I just sent you. Okay, those
great.
are favorite signs.
And maybe we can integrate this. So too,
Sure.
when you're thinking of your favorite signs, just think about how it's really gone from being advertising to a landmark. The other thing that's really interesting to think about is it a candidate for restoration, and why that is. For me, and when we try to restore signs in San Francisco, sometimes the biggest question is, how much does the owner of the sign care about it? And that can be a real deciding factor. Okay, so in San Francisco, there were just neon signs all over Chinatown in the 1960s. And then there's a lot of different theories as to why these signs started to disappear. But we like to show these two postcards. You can see from 1960 to 1965, a lot of these beautiful signs were just taken down in Grant Avenue of Chinatown. And that's a little bit what happened, is a lot of the nightlife started to move to other parts of the city. So as Chinatown became more and more a daytime destination, we saw a lot of the neon signs come down. Now, one of our favorite survivors is the Golden Star Radio, and this is just off of Grant Avenue in San Francisco, and it's just such a beautiful monument to a great little piece of history. And that is that the Golden Star Radio Hour, that was like the tiniest little basement radio station run by Mary Chin Tong and her husband Tommy, and did a little research and found out it was the absolutely first Chinese language radio station in North America. And it was run out of the basement of a appliance store where they sold radios. So they thought, what better way to sell radios than to have a radio station? Now, the store is long gone. This is a beautiful photograph of Mary reading the news and her radio orchestra. And the building is no longer used, and yet the Golden Star Radio sign is just beautiful on the side of the building and can be seen from the bus line. And it's just a great local landmark and a monument to this chapter in Chinatown history. Another favorite is the Hills Brothers coffee sign. And this is an example of a building that used to represent light industry in San Francisco and now has been completely taken over by a tech company. So that shows a little bit of the history of San Francisco, and yet the Hills Brothers coffee sign shines on. And it was restored by this guy, John Law, and he completely restored the bottom of each of these letter forms, which had been rusted out. And this is a great example of John, because he loves to work on all the roof signs all over the Bay Area. But also you see how thin the tube is on a sign that can be seen clear across the bay. So it's interesting to note that the thinner the tube, the brighter the light, because the atoms are bouncing around, and that makes it even brighter. So let's go to the next one here. And this is another landmark in San Francisco, which is the Castro Theater. And it enjoyed a full restoration, and it was Hollywood money. They were making a biopic on Harvey Milk. And so this beautiful sign and marquee were restored. And again, this is an interesting landmark. It represents the gay community in San Francisco. It represents this neighborhood. It also represents the city at large. And it's certainly come to represent film history, and houses like every major film festival in the city. So this one sign is a different landmarks to different groups, but also a beautiful landmark for the whole city. And this sign really needed some love. You can see that the bottom of the blade here was completely rusted out, about to fall onto the ground. And the crew did an amazing job of really bringing it back to beautiful restoration. I showed you a picture of Shawna Peterson before. This is her putting in the crown of the blade sign up on the scaffolding. And this work was done by 3 really great neon champions in the Bay Area. Jim Rizzo in the middle is Libby Cahill and Shawna Peterson. So we work really closely with them, and we've learned so much about restoration from these three. And a recent project, very much on the same scale as the Castro Theater, is the Avenue Theater, which is out in the Portola district. And that's a district that comes under the, I don't know if you would say protection or of the SF Shines project, which Stephanie's going to talk about, and also the Office of Economic and Workforce Development. And so to kind of bring back or stimulate some economic activity in this neighborhood, they decided they would go for a full restoration of this long forgotten and unused sign and theater. And I think it took about 4 months. And there you see a little in progress message of the E and lit up, almost ready to go. And there you see the before and after. And it really has done a great job of bringing a lot of pride back to the neighborhood and has already started economic activity, and new businesses are moving into this block. So I think we're chalking this up as a big success story. And we learned so much on that project, and really got involved with other neon restorers all over the country with our Neon Speaks conference. And the National Trust for Historic Preservation was generous with a grant so that we could compile and print this guidebook, Saving Neon, Best Practices. We would go to everyone and say, has anybody ever written down the best practices for restoring a neon sign? And the answer was always the same. Oh, you guys should do that, and send us a copy when you do it. So we took up the challenge. And two of the most, I think, interesting things that we learned was the whole idea of paint and how paint can really preserve a sign, just like a car or a building. Once the paint comes off, then the deterioration really starts. The other thing was that idea of, gee, isn't LED just as good as neon? And what about bulbs? And so we really did some research and really found that, yeah, LED bulbs are definitely much more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs, but neon is actually much closer to LED in efficiency than it is to incandescent. So that was a big eye-opener for us. And so all of the pages in the Saving Neon guidebook are done in this question and answer format. So it's not really intended to be a book for people who already know how to restore signs, but for people who are interested in restoring a sign in their neighborhood and want to be informed, want to know something about everything that goes in to create a successful project, whether that's technical, community-wise, budget-wise. We tried to put it all into one 40-page guidebook that's really going to help you on your way. Okay, let me go forward here. The last project that we want to do a little case study is this beautiful sign in Chinatown, the LiPo Lounge. And I just like to put these two photos in. Here you can see Rita Hayworth in the movie Lady from Shanghai, and you can clearly see that this LiPo sign is behind her, which dates it. It's over 70 years old. And it's so unusual in that it's an 8-sided sign, and it really becomes a landmark in Chinatown. Here you can see in this mid-century New Year's parade. And we were lucky enough to be able to be the historic color consultants on this. So this is an example of the kind of color consults that we do of the paint, not only the paint, but also of the colors of the tubes. And the sign really needed some love. It had been in disrepair for quite a long time. And we documented the process of restoration every step of the way. And that also ensured that we were really involved and got to know all the guys. And women that were working on this project so that we could answer questions and really help with every little decision, which makes a big difference in the outcome of a restoration project. And there you can see the before and after. It's really pretty dramatic. And we were thrilled that even the New York Times was interested in this project and took a photograph. It was on the cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine a few weeks ago. And it really is so photogenic and has gotten a lot of press. So this slide is just to show you that people are interested in neon signs, and we're always surprised how busy we are being asked to do events and talks. And even in April alone, we've got a full schedule, and we're just always very moved to see how much interest there is out there for saving old neon signs. And we know the reason is because they are community landmarks. So anybody that's going to be in San Francisco or would like to come on April 26th to 28th, we'll be doing our symposium and festival. It's a really fun way to get together with other people, share information, share stories. And that's one of the most important things if you're interested in restoring or saving a neon sign is don't do it in a vacuum. Find out what everybody else is doing and get the benefit of people like you'll hear from Stephanie and from Lynette, who really are experts, and we're all learning great things from each other. So that's my presentation.
Okay, just really quick, are you going to pull up maybe one or two of the favorite signs?
Sure, yeah. So let me pass this on to Lynette, and then I can get going on that.
Okay.
Thank you, Randall Ann. I am now showing my screen, but do you want me to pass it back to you when you have things that are pulled up from the...
Yeah, I'll speak up when I've got a few ready.
Well, with that, what I'll do is well, Randall Ann, thank you so much for that informative and a lot of just beautiful images of neon signs. That was incredible. And with that, what I'm going to do while Randall Ann is pulling up some of the images of your favorite signs, I'm going to introduce Lynette, our next speaker. She's a graduate of USC School of Architecture, Master of Heritage Conservation Program with a sole price public policy graduate certificate in sustainable cities. She utilizes her graduate work and education in conjunction with her professional experience in the insurance and legal marketing industries to educate, consult, and advocate for the conservation of historic resources. Currently, she has established a historic sign conservation consultant business and is volunteering for Hollywood Heritage, Inc., a local nonprofit preservation advocacy group. She is the Hollywood Heritage Preservation Committee member and a past board member with a personal mission to conserve commercial historic signs in Hollywood. How are we doing on images, Randall?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Okay. With that, I'm going to see if you can multitask, Randall Ann. I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think are the two most important aspects of neon best practices?
Well, you know, the most important, I think, is the one I mentioned is don't do it in a vacuum. Really reach out to other people that are doing it and gather information. You don't have to become an expert, but the more information you can gather, I can guarantee the better your restoration project will turn out. And then I think the other most important thing is take your time. You know, sometimes we see these very quick and dirty restorations on old signs so that they get illuminated very quickly, and sometimes that is actually not what's good for the sign. And sometimes it can be wiring that is actually not not that safe. And this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens when you're in a rush and in a hurry. So I guess you could say that about almost any project, but it certainly applies to neon restoration.
Well, thank you. Those are very important aspects. I appreciate that answer. One other question while you're still looking for an image. What makes you so passionate about saving neon signs, Randall Ann?
Oh, well, I think it's one, it's the light and the color, and being an artist and a graphic designer, photographer, those are the things that really, really appeal to me. But the other part of it is that old signs, and sometimes they're just like are hidden in plain sight. And so it's that discovery of finding an old sign that you maybe walked down the street or drove by and you suddenly realize, wow, that's something that's really been around a long time. And you look at it and you realize, and it was made by hand. It's not a logo printed on plastic with a LED light behind it. It really is sculpture and something. Every neon sign is made by hand, and it's made by somebody with an artistic vision. So in some ways, that's what we realized. We looked around our community and say, we have a collection of art just like a collection of paintings in a museum, but it's an art on the street, and neon signs really just inform every neighborhood of our community. And we loved hanging on to that part of our landscape.
Wow,
and
great.
I'm trying to bring up the dancing pig. Somebody of San Jose, somebody suggested that, and we do have a great photo of that.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to pick that one.
Yeah. And let's see if I can find that really quick.
Honestly, this is Christine. I'm just jumping in because you're looking for the signs. I was surprised that I didn't see anyone mention anything about the old Arby's sign with the giant cowboy hat. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I think those are just the best. Whenever I see one of those signs, I have to smile.
And there's one preserved at the Ignite Sign Museum in Tucson, which is a brand new sign museum that just opened.
Oh, get out. It's just the best sign. It's so huge.
Yeah.
Well, Christine, it's so funny that you mentioned that sign because one of my colleagues with the International Sign Association's father designed that sign. So, and I actually have included it in some presentations. So I'm not kidding. So that's really interesting that you brought that up.
This was unplanned, everybody.
We also have one in Hollywood. It's still functioning on Sunset Boulevard.
Okay. All right. So if you want to give me I can show one right now. It's kind of a funny one, but if you want to give me back control, I'll show you the pig, and I actually made it dance. Okay. So hopefully you can see, this is a little GIF, but that is the dancing pig of San Jose. And Heather David and the Preservation Action Council of San Jose have worked so hard to save this sign and restore it. The jury's still out because it's one of those signs that was just left in an empty lot, and it's not really clear who owns it. All right, I'll give this back to you, Lynette, while I look for another one.
And then I think I'll get started.
Okay. Why don't I pull a few up, James, and then I can show them in between Lynette and Stephanie.
That sounds good. So Lynette, after your presentation, we can pull up a couple more favorite signs. How's that sound?
Sure, sounds great. So I think Randall Ann brought up a number of key themes and identified a couple of things that planners really grapple with when the signs start to disappear. And that's usually what inspires new programs to be started. And today, while we're talking about neon, it really applies to all historic signs. So painted signs, and we're going to talk a little bit about mural signs and how they differ. But the thing about considering it public art is that it still is a commercial sign. And the commercial sign use regulations for most cities dictates how that's going to be handled in terms of their maximum real estate on a facade and what they can use for their own signage. And so it gets a little bit complicated. We're going to use the city of Burbank and a case study in Hollywood, the Vogue Theater, and how things kind of fall between in the gaps, and what LA is doing to help preserve historic signs, and what Burbank has recently done in creating a program. And then later, Stephanie's going to talk about the vintage program. And those are all a lot about incentivizing owners so that they're able to repair their signs, remove their signs, put them back, because as you saw some of the restoration pictures that Randall Ann was showing, they have to do it on site. And doing it on site to avoid removing the sign for code regulation can be very costly. So I think a financial incentive is to allow the code to allow the owner to remove the sign, restore it, and replace it without having to go through the scaffolding and different kinds of things that cost a lot of money. So, okay, here we go. So one thing that came out of the Saving Neon Best Practices Guide was there's a woman, Deborah Jane Seltzer, and she went across America and, like Randall Ann and Al, had documented a lot of the neon vintage signs throughout America starting in 2001. And she really compiles, a nationwide analysis of where the signs exist and puts a percentage on them from her database. And she captured over 10,000 signs. Now, this is a really good starting point, but for most cities, they have regulations that say a qualified survey has to be organized and hired by the city and reporting back to the city. So this is a good kind of crowdsourcing analysis of what exists and where they are. And I think it's a good starting point for a lot of cities to look at how what their inventory is in comparison, just on a percentage basis. It's not a definitive type of inventory by any means, but it is a good starting point. And we included it in the Best Practices Guide to illustrate kind of the disappearing resources that are happening across America. So, a lot of this terminology for preservationists is a little bit more specified in our profession. So I wanted to bring the term standards, which are the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is a lot of how the treatment of historic resources are guided through the process. But preservation is only one of those treatments. Rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction are the others. And a lot of these signs technically go through what we call a rehabilitation. And so it's really good that you familiarize yourself and go to the website and look at what those different terminologies mean from a National Park Service or a Secretary of the Interior standards, because a lot of these signs get repaired without thinking about these guidelines. And the National Park Service also has the Sign Preservation Brief 25, which helps outline what their vision is of rehabilitation. So I encourage you to go there and think about that as we go through the terminology the different people use. I think that the community is going to use the word historic and landmark a little bit more loosely than perhaps a consultant would in the preservation community. Okay, so policy themes and the takeaways today. I think one thing, this is a picture that you're looking at of the Papoose hot dog show sign, and it's in Burbank. And this is the sign that Umami Burger decided to remove the hot dog. And in the process, the community really cried out and said, what's going on here? And it really spurred the city to start a survey and then also create a program. But what you find out when you go through a lot of these stories about signs being taken down is that most cities have not actually done a historic citywide sign survey. A lot of people have done surveys citywide, including Los Angeles, but it's not a sign focus. And that's one of the reasons why they actually specifically did a historic sign survey. They have a small area. It's a city with a population of 100,000. It's only 17 square miles, so you can see that that's a more achievable type of adventure versus like the City of LA, which has been inventorying for 10 years under the Survey LA and has provided some context, but we'll get that later. Most financial carrots are tied to something that would be a qualified historic resource. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. And from a regulatory standpoint, most cities don't require, hold on here, historic resource review before an alteration is done. So I think a lot of those quick repairs that Randall Ann was talking about, they don't actually pull permits or have any kind of review that guides them through a process that would allow them to slow down and pick the right materials, investigate what the original paint colors were, the original neon tubing, and the gases. So I think that what a review process does give you from a historic review standpoint is the ability to slow down and get it right. The big issue, non-conforming signs on site, for the on-site repairs we talked about a little bit earlier, are not financially feasible for small business owners. And I think that the San Francisco program that you're going to hear about from Stephanie really focuses in on the small business owner, and they're trying to help them in the preservation or rehabilitation of those signs. So here's a photo here to the left of the Burbank Historic Sign Survey, and I've actually attached it in your resources that James talked about earlier, so you can actually download it and take a look at all the documents that were associated with that process, including the staff reports that I included. So in 2014, they created this sign survey, and it was a CLG grant that they used for funding of the actual survey. It established a starting point, and it listed eligible historic signs, not just neon, but painted signs and other types of signs in Burbank. And it kind of answers the question of what makes a sign historic. It goes through and gives you the context, whether it's pre-war, post-war, the materials, and the development of Burbank and what the sign means to its community. It does use the 50-year roughly mark. They looked at everything 45 years and older, and I think that's going to be something we talk about later, the difference between historic and vintage. A little bit of it is tied to how old is it. So I went through and organized the policy regulatory themes and outlined what the city of Burbank did. So non-conforming signs, they intended to help grandfather in or deem unpermitted or illegal signage that were vintage or historic and allow them to be repaired so that they don't have to be repaired on site. The unintended demolition or the neglect of a specific sign, and that we were looking at some of those that Randall Ann had pictures of where the paint is starting to deteriorate, and the useful life of the metal material is really about 50 years. So we're coming into this age where the metal materials are deteriorating, the signs are in disrepair, and the city code is really not helping the owner repair them or keep them if it's a business that's not theirs anymore, and put up new signage to allow their business to be seen and known. So the Papoose Hot Dog Show sign was a little combination of all of that. The Umami wanted to put their sign in the middle of the hot dog show structure, so they removed the neon elements and they put up an Umami burger sign in that little showcase and structure. So it was an alteration. It is reversible to some extent because they did save the neon. So that's a good thing. We'll talk about where that ended up later. And the new ordinance was developed to address policy gaps, and it was codified in 2016. So it's a relatively new ordinance, and they're, right now exploring kind of how it's going to work. The city of Tucson also has a new ordinance, and I think James mentioned that the city of Salt Lake City, Utah has done the same thing. And a lot of these programs are trying to plug the gaps so that you don't see the rapid deterioration right now or disappearance of those signs. It is a voluntary program for legal reasons, and I think that LA probably highlights this the best. We had banning billboard blight, and we had litigation surrounding that, and what resulted was that if you're going to do a sign program, because of its legal implications of freedom of speech and some other things, and the best way to do it is on a voluntary basis. And I think what you'll see in all of these programs is that there's some kind of owner consent, and then how, what those options are if the owner at some point decides that they don't want to maintain their historic sign, and the relocation options. Was there a survey? Yes, the CLG grant was helpful in preparing the context statement and an inventory. Qualified historic designation. It is, and for Burbank, they define what a qualified historic designation means within their city code. And that's important because every city is going to have a different definition, actually, of what a qualified historic designation means to them and their historic review. So acknowledgement and consent waiver. I think every one of these programs has some form of this, and it's just up to the city attorneys on how they want their owners to comply in exchange for these incentives in order to maintain it. And then there's the treatment plan. Some of them tie their consent waiver to a treatment plan, saying that you must follow a treatment plan that we've outlined for you. And the city of Tucson has done that, Burbank has done that, and Stephanie will highlight if their program does that. And lastly, well, not lastly, but second to lastly, there's a demolition stay. And this is different than the regular historic preservation for building stay. This is specific to the signs, where they are allowed to relocate or salvage the sign. And I think this is an important pause before a sign disappears. So there's a lot of museums and other interested parties that if you had to relocate a sign, that is the sort of last resort for saving them. And then the financial incentives and carrots, waiving fees, and giving them a sign area bonus were all things that were included. And the real important part is that's recorded with the land, and that is that it would pass from one owner to the next. The consent element would be something to disclose during that transaction. Okay, so now we're going to talk about CEQA exemption in California. For those who are not in California, bear with us a little bit on this, but this example actually shows a current trend, which is the conversion of marquees to a digital screen, and how this can possibly go wrong because it is in a historic district. So to the left here, you see the Vogue Theater, and this was a 1935 photo, which was the original building, and does fall within the historic district period of significance. However, it was modified and altered in 1959. Therefore, it falls outside the period of significance for the district, and this resource, because it wasn't 50 years old at the time, wasn't identified until very late that it could be a possible resource, and right now we're updating that. But in the permit world, in the city planning world, city planners approved a full conversion where you see the neon elements, the Vogue Scrabble letter signs, box signs there, into all digital, which you see in the architectural drawing. Well, when we found out about it at Hollywood Heritage, we decided that we were going to appeal the process and explain that those were character-defining features of the sign and that it was potentially an eligible sign, and that really the marquee was the portion where it was allowed within our sign use district to be converted, not the entire sign, but just the white part where it says Supper Club Saturday night. That was the code. Somehow in this interpretation, they were replacing the entire thing. And then the picture to the right is what you'll see is what actually happened in the negotiation. They actually lost square footage because they didn't want to start all over again, and they decided to drop the sign down under the neon elements, and therefore preserving or conserving the neon elements that ribbon across, which are definitely a character-defining feature of the marquee. And it was a compromise that I think can be met when everyone's involved, when the stakeholders are involved that care about the sign. So another element is the community education about what these signs are and how to speak out in the event they start to see alterations. So the city of LA is kind of complicated, more complicated than most. And I bring the Broadway Hollywood sign story to you because it has a couple of interesting components that you might think about. One is that the building is a 1920s building, and it started out as the Diaz building, which you see on the upper left-hand corner. And the sign structure was likely reused when it was changed to the Broadway Hollywood. And this is a different angle because I don't have the same angle in the historic photo, but the circle tracks the same sign across this presentation. And in the beginning, they had a citywide sign ordinance that they used, and they put up this neon sign, open panel. There's a sign district that comes into play in 2004 and updated in 2010. And then we had an adaptive reuse ordinance that came in and said you could adapt a building. This was then converted to lofts, live-work lofts. And the building itself is a historic monument. And during that process, they actually identified the rooftop sign as a historic resource, character-defining feature of the building, which was all good. In the process, though, they built up a separate section, which you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, which now supports a new panel that's going to house a new open panel sign for new advertising. So we retained one of the historic signs, but what they gained was another sign parcel. The sign parcel was retained by the developer and does not belong to the building. So there's no tether between the advertising dollars that will stream from the future sign to the restoration or rehabilitation or any maintenance of any of the historic resources on site. So that was something that I think could be remedied in city planning, but was allowed, and I think that the idea of an adaptive reuse and saving a historic building and historic resources kind of overrode the disconnect between the sign parcel and the historic building. So there's other things that come into play in one of those types of projects, but it seems like a lot of our planning is, individual building plans. And we also have business improvement districts that dictate storefront signs and streetscape sign plans, but each one really needs an analysis of where it falls and what its rights are. And most of the historic sign bonus and transfer rights are in the sign use districts. So those do not exist citywide. They're generally in historic districts like Broadway and downtown LA and in Hollywood. So there's something else you can use. If you are in California, sorry again for those who are not, but you can actually look at this and probably gain some insight as to what could be done. And that is to have a historical building code that can be integrated into your framework for things that are actually local, state, or national landmarks. And there's, again, a definition of what that means. And a lot of these vintage signs don't fall into that. So encouraging people to actually designate as a local, state, or national qualified historic resource is what the community education process, I think, needs to engage in and submit to make sure that they can take advantage of the codes, which are a flexibility for repairs and safety so that they can do workarounds and not have to comply with the current codes. So what makes a local ordinance or program relating to historic signs, and I'm going to put all types of signs here, is that you survey, you have a specific survey, you create a separate application because it has information there that's different than a building. You have incentives built in so that you have ways for small businesses to actually achieve the retention of the sign. Treatment plans, very important. As Randall, explored, all of these materials are very unique. Replicating them, finding people to do them, it takes time, and it's a skill that we're losing. We don't have that many people that are now skilled at actually making these repairs. Demolition stays gives the opportunity for things to survive, and relocation options. Knowing your relocation options as a city, maybe have a list of museums or places that might be interested in taking these signs on. So what happened to our papoose? Burbank's Papoose Hot Dog Show sign ended up in the Hats Off to Hollywood exhibit in 2016, and you can see them there at the bottom. And so it could be put back. It could be reversed. And I think when it goes to a museum or somewhere else, you might think about that. Is this a sign that could be reversed if a new owner takes interest in replacing the sign? And that I think we haven't seen yet, but I think we will start to see some of the museums work out if they can put them back into actual context, I think that they'd be open to that. So that concludes a lot of the nuts and bolts of what goes on in these historic sign programs. And it's so complicated, I couldn't get it all in these 10 slides. But I think that if you had any questions, you could certainly type them in now. And I will turn it back to Randall Ann if she's ready for any more actual signs, favorite signs that you guys have submitted.
Okay, sorry, I was not muted there. All right, so let's take a look. I did find some signs. This is a favorite sign. I love this one. It's the Portland, Oregon sign, but it's sometimes referred to as the White Stag sugar sign. And the outline of the state of Oregon at one time actually used to fill up with bulbs, to like a sack of sugar filling up. And you can see this on, I forget the name of the bridge, but it is just, I can't think of a better landmark of a neon sign for a city than the White Stag sign for Portland. So thanks to whoever suggested that. I'd never seen this Quaker sign before. And so this is in New Philadelphia, Ohio, and a beautiful Art Deco theater. And cues are always a puzzle to solve for tube benders. And this one's just gorgeous. I did not know about the Marietta bread sign, and I found a photo that has 2 onlookers for scale. This is a massive sign, and it's in Orlando, Florida.
Randall, and if I could, I just wanted to add something. This is James. On the both of those both of the signs that we were looking at, Merlita and the what was the other one called?
The Quaker and
the Quaker. Yeah, both of these have they're open pan channel letters with neon inside. Just as far as a little description, see, it's you can go ahead. Keep moving on.
All right, great. So now we're looking at the House of Doors. I did not know about this sign, but it's really a beauty, and I love signs that have arrows incorporated in them. This is in Brookfield, Illinois. I also love the little 50s, our 50th year, how that little red, sometimes that's called a amoeba shape, mid-century shape. So that's a really nice little design element on this sign. This Tower Theater in Bend, Oregon is just gorgeous. And again, another beautiful Art Deco facade. And also interesting how the blade is fully above the building and not attached to the side of it. Someone said, well, you got to show the Radio City Music Hall, which of course we do. One of the most iconic neon signs in the world. And I chose this view because I've always just loved the script that says Music Hall. Very, very beautiful and iconic. And as James said, that's also, I believe, in a channel. The script letters are channel, which I find particularly beautiful and I'm sure not easy to fabricate. Someone mentioned Welcome to Colorful Colorado, which is not neon, but you gotta love it. And I chose this photo because you can see all the stickers, how well loved this sign is. So thanks for suggesting that. And I guess there are several of these in entries to all the entryways into the state. And then someone did mention the Citgo sign. And when I was researching, I found the article that this has now been fully converted to LED. And it's a huge sign that you can see from the baseball stadium in Boston. And I'm sure that this, when it was neon, really pulled down a lot of energy. And that may be one reason that it was converted to LED. I don't know if anybody else knows. Okay, so those are the signs that were shared. And so thank you guys for sharing sharing your favorite signs with us. And let's see if I can give the controls back.
Well, thank you, Randall Ann,
Yeah.
for your discourse on those wonderful looking signs. And now I'm going to introduce our last speaker today. It's Stephanie Cisneros. Stephanie graduated from USC, University of Southern California School of Architecture with a Master of Heritage Conservation degree in 2014. She has worked for the San Francisco Planning Department since 2015 as a preservation planner, focusing on environmental review for historic preservation, as well as general residential and commercial development projects. Most recently, she has become the point contact for the City of San Francisco's Vintage Sign Authorization Program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephanie. It's all yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As James said, my name is Stephanie Cisneros. I'm a preservation planner with the San Francisco Planning Department. And today I kind of just want to dive into a very kind of small, rather hidden component program embedded within our local planning code. Some people might not be super familiar with it. I for one, was not even aware that this was a program until maybe about 2 years ago. But it's definitely been an interesting program to learn about and help implement as part of our larger kind of planning goals. So just to give a little bit of kind of a summary of this program, it's called our Vintage Sign Authorization Program. It's one of a couple different resources that the city overall has to help ensure the preservation of historic or vintage signs that really speak to kind of the cultural, social, architectural development of San Francisco. As kind of a little bit of a sidebar, as the field of preservation or heritage conservation becomes more and more engaged with understanding the built environment as it relates to cultural and social development of the city, signs are becoming increasingly important in telling these stories and in really understanding the cultural significance of a place, and begins to kind of inform our larger processes for allowing future development. Cool. So some key takeaways from my presentation today are really to kind of get folks thinking about looking at what sign regulations and programs their cities or their jurisdictions may have. What really are the sign regulations, and what are regulations, if any, related to historic or vintage signs? Really to kind of also get people thinking about local preservation programs and kind of how the two are related, or how they can be related. What role can these preservation programs outside of looking at a planning department? Maybe it's a nonprofit, maybe it's kind of an advocacy group similar to what Randall and Al kind of have put together for San Francisco. How can these groups kind of talk to the city, and how can everybody kind of talk to each other, also involving the community? How can everybody talk to each other to share ideas and kind of develop these similar types of programs to ensure the longevity of these signs? So I'm going to get a little bit technical and just kind of dive right into the ordinance itself. Just to kind of give some background information, the Vintage Sign Ordinance was initially passed by the Board of Supervisors in 1998 and was then added to the Planning Code. It was originally added as a process for designating historic sign districts. However, this was kind of amended by the Board of Supervisors in 2011 to become what it is today, where it's actually a process of designating individual signs as vintage signs. So we kind of moved away from looking at signs on a historic district level and started looking at them more on a case-by-case basis. And I'll talk about kind of one example that really jolted the ordinance to be revised to what it is today. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in essence, vintage signs are historic signs that were erected 40 or more years ago. Typically, they're considered to be non-compliant and do not meet current requirements and standards for signs outlined in our planning code. They're typically much larger than signage that gets approved today. And then the process for designating vintage signs includes what we call a conditional use authorization application. So this application is typically tied to uses on a property. However, we've kind of also looped into that this specific way of designating vintage signs. And this process typically requires a public hearing by the Planning Commission, and then also their review and approval. We, as part of this application process, we need to have some, substantial evidence to indicate that the sign was, has been around for 40 or more years, that it is eligible for designation. And typically that kind of documentation comes in the form of photos. What we're finding is that these larger, older vintage signs are most of the time did not go through the permitting process when they were put up. So we really kind of rely on historic photo documentation to help kind of build the case for eligibility. It is a voluntary program, similar to kind of what's going on in Burbank. It's voluntary case-by-case, basis. As part of this process, we do typically require property owner consent to allow us to designate or to allow the sign to be designated. But what we're learning is that this kind of brings up the question of who actually owns the sign. Is it the business that the sign is tied to that owns it, or is it the property owner, themselves that actually own the sign? So this is something that we kind of are having an ongoing discussion of and trying to figure out ways to make sure that we're involving our city attorney on this to make sure that we're going about this, the appropriate, the legal way. So just there's two different criteria that allow a sign to be considered eligible for designation as a vintage sign, one of which I mentioned, it needs to be at least 40 years old. And then it also needs to have some sort of narrative tied to it or some sort of significance tied to it that explains why and how it's important to the city as a whole, or specifically to the community within which it's located, and kind of how it's contributed and continues to contribute to the character of the city, whether it's telling a story of a bakery that's no longer there, or telling kind of cinematic history and kind of cinematic development in San Francisco. What's really the story that's tied to the sign that makes it qualify as a vintage sign? Most often, these signs are tied to businesses that have become very important establishments to the community or the city at large. But like I said, other times they can be tied to recreational areas, points of interest, almost similar to the Colorado sign, where they have a welcome to Colorado. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a business sign, and I'll kind of show an example of that a little bit later on. So there's a couple of different benefits to going through this process of being designated as a vintage sign. One huge benefit is that it's allowed to remain as it exists in its non-compliant state, as long as it's kind of maintained as such. So once the sign has been designated a vintage sign, it's allowed to stay. It doesn't need to kind of be brought into conformance with our signs, regulations and standards, as long as it's kind of maintained in its vintage historic state. And this is beneficial for a number of reasons, the most important being that it's allowed to remain as a historic artifact that really tells the development of a specific neighborhood or of, the larger city. And then another kind of, great benefit is that if there's, say for example, we have a business that has a sign that's currently going through the vintage sign designation process, if that business were to relocate to another location, they would be allowed to take that sign with them to their new location, and it would not need to be kind of, as long as it was designated, it would not need to be brought into conformance with our other sign standards or regulations. So there's, kind of ensuring the longevity of these signs, whether it's in their original location or elsewhere, tied to the business or entity that with which it's associated. And then one other kind of really great benefit of going through this process for signs is that once it's designated, it doesn't count against any new signage that might be proposed for that specific location. So for example, if we have kind of a vacant storefront with a sign that qualifies as a vintage sign, it's a sign that the community loves and regards highly, if there's a new business that's coming into that new space or coming into that space, and they really want to keep that sign and they want to, it's valuable to the community. They really love it. There's just, all sorts of great feelings about this sign. They are allowed to take that sign through the designation process. Once it gets designated, it doesn't count against any new signage that new business would want to kind of have in order to identify themselves as a new business. So it allows for kind of an interesting story to be told where you have this great vintage sign that's been designated, but then you also kind of have this new business who's allowed to go in and put in their own signage, and it really kind of tells a little bit, it speaks to kind of the development of that area and kind of how it's evolved and how it's changed, while still being able to, kind of keep both. And then some kind of other really great benefits include, it just really existing as a representation of the history of San Francisco, really being able to kind of tell those stories of a very much different time, where these signs were, a huge part of, the commercial development or whatever kind of area it's located in. They really, they visually are attractive, but then they also kind of speak to the emotional and kind of developmental ties to understanding the history of San Francisco. And as we kind of begin to look at more cultural or social-based properties of significance within our larger historic preservation program, we're really beginning to include signs and vintage signs specifically as key features that tell the significance of an area, or even of a historic district, a cultural district, or a legacy business that might not otherwise be apparent through architecture. So it's really in the, I guess, on the, a little bit of the more like emotional side, these vintage signs really are important to telling this story of the city and kind of the development and how it's come to where we are today. As Randall Ann mentioned a little bit earlier, the city does also have, not within the planning department, but within the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, there is a program that's called the SF Shines program. And it's really developed, it's a program that's developed to offer grants to help improve storefront facades and business interiors. And so they offer grants for things like signage, which would also help, if you have a sign that's designated a vintage sign, it would kind of help bolster the argument for, applying for a grant to help maintain and repair and rehabilitate signage. But they also offer grants for, awnings, windows, lighting, security, ADA compliance, and just overall maintenance and repair. And it's the two programs have kind of most recently been coming together a little bit more often, because what we're seeing is, a lot of these kind of older storefronts want to come in and kind of do a refresh of their interior and exteriors, and as part of that, they want to designate these vintage signs so that they can, get some funding to help maintain and rehab and repair these signs. And so it's a good way for kind of these two agencies to work together to kind of offer these incentives to business and property owners to help ensure their longevity as a business, but also the longevity of their physical features, which include signs. So just to go into a couple of examples, this is the Coca-Cola sign in Bernal Heights. It's painted directly onto the side of a mixed-use building. It was the first vintage sign designated in 2012 after kind of the amendments to the ordinance had gone through. We moved away from looking at historic sign districts and kind of started implementing it more as a case-by-case individual vintage sign designation program. And so this one is kind of interesting. It's a 15 by 7 foot 1930s era sign, and it features, the Coca-Cola logo with a silhouetted woman drinking from a glass bottle. And, there was some kind of debate, but, over this sign. We had kind of a split, mixed feelings about the sign. Many supporters came out, speaking against the sign, saying that they wanted to see it painted over because there was an issue with the idea of, the corporate aspects of Coca-Cola. And kind of what Coca-Cola, to them stood for, maybe an unhealthy lifestyle and kind of things like that. They felt that was not appropriate in an area which, in a mostly residential with family area. Whereas on the other side, there were, residents and kind of business owners who came out saying, no, this is, we understand that you're concerned with kind of the meaning of the sign, but this is something that we really treasure in the neighborhood. It's not meant to kind of be imposing certain ways of life on people. It's really art. They really considered it art. So kind of within that larger debate, we ended up with the ordinance that we have today. This was the first vintage sign that was designated in 2012, and it still remains today. So then we have another example, which was my first interaction with the vintage sign ordinance. So this is Doc's Clock. On the left, you can see the original sign in its original location at 2575 Mission Street. It was a bar that opened up in 1951, originally named the Clock Bar, but then in 1961, the bar changed its name to Doc's Clock. And so while we don't have an exact, date of when this sign was originally put up, we can imagine that it came sometime after the bar changed its name to Doc's Clock. This on the original sign on the left is interesting because it actually, the faces of the sign were put over a much older, I think it was like early 1910s, like marquee almost. So they kind of just refaced it with what it was, when they were at their original location. Doc's Clock, the bar itself, went through the legacy business designation program, which is another kind of program for historic businesses to kind of receive access to different financial incentives. But the Doc's Clock bar went through that designation process, and with that, they were able to, they utilized kind of the incentives from the legacy business program to help them relocate to, I think it was like a block over on Mission Street. So they were able to kind of use that funding to get themselves established at a new location. They used the vintage sign designation or vintage sign authorization program to get the sign designated as a vintage sign so that they would be able to kind of relocate it to their new location. One thing that's, if you can see on the right, that's their new location. And if you notice, the sign looks a little bit different than it did at their original location. And that's because with them getting the sign designated, it would have been too big for them to take it as is over to their new location. Their storefront at their new location was much smaller, but the new property owner for their new location was willing to kind of let them bring the sign over. You know, they knew it was an iconic structure that was tied to their significance, but given kind of the size constraints of the actual storefront component that they had for their new location, we kind of worked with them to modify it a little bit so that they could take, you know, the most viable faces of the existing sign and kind of fit it to the size constraints of their new location. So it was definitely something that was, you know, very interesting to kind of work with them to figure out, okay, work with them and also kind of work with our zoning administrator to really figure out what's the best way for them to move this sign where it won't lose its vintage sign status. One thing to note with being designated a vintage sign is that, you know, any kind of substantial modifications, whether it's, you know, removing the name from the sign, removing any vital components that qualify it as a vintage sign, it's considered an abandonment of the vintage sign itself, and it would no longer qualify to be a vintage sign. So we wanted to make sure that we did this in a way that was kind of got them the best, you know, solution to keeping the sign and taking it with them while not kind of modifying it so much so that it would no longer be considered a vintage sign. So this is the kind of, you know, it's a little bit smaller, but I think the way that they did it, the way that they, you know, kind of took the docked clock, made that the central component of the sign, and then added the martini glasses on either side, maintaining the arrows. They, you know, I think they did it in such a way that it's, you know, it's definitely, it works, and it's still eligible to be considered a vintage sign. And then so just last but not least, the Ghirardelli sign actually just recently underwent vintage sign designation. Actually, I think it was like a month or two ago. It was, you know, designated a vintage sign. It was constructed originally in 1915 and underwent some restoration in the 60s as a part of an overall adaptive reuse of the property. Yeah, and it was recently designated, and the purpose of them kind of now pursuing vintage sign designation is so that they can actually go in and do a full restoration of this sign, which they otherwise wouldn't be allowed to do because it's a non-compliant sign. So that really kind of ties my you know, whirlwind of a presentation. I'm available for any questions, and yeah, thank you.
Could you please scroll to the last slide there so that James can wrap up for us real quick? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for the summary slide, I'm just going to real quickly, because we're over time. In summary, when dealing with neon signs, follow best practices, and it's outlined really well in Saving Neon Best Practices Guide that Randall Land talked about, and determine the community interest in historic and vintage signs, which has been talked about a lot today. And the components of the historic vintage regulations considerations, flexibility is important, incentives seems to be extremely important, as do the other parts that we talked about. So with that, thank you for your attendance. And Christine, I'm going to turn it back to you for closing. And I think we've got one more slide that has the link to our resource, I think right after this, at the end. Keep going.
There we go.
There we go.
Oops. Okay, thanks everybody. Sorry we went over on time. We didn't get a chance to answer any of your questions, but I'm forwarding all the questions to our panelists, and you can feel free to reach out to them at their email addresses that are on your screen now. And as always, we are recording this presentation. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will have a copy of this session as a PDF on our webcast webpage. Last but not least, we are still working to get those CM credits up on APA CM portal. So please bear with us. I promise you, I will let you all know when they are available. You will get an email and it will be posted on our Facebook page and on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks everyone, and thanks to the County Planning Division and to James, Lynette, Stephanie, Randall. Thanks for joining us today, and everyone, we'll talk next time. Have a great weekend.